We don't have in the New Testament a life of Jesus. What we have are 4 independent evangelists. The early church did not call these the Gospels, they called them the evangelists. The 4 evangelists each are like evangelistic tracts, more or less, booklets, if you will, that were sent out to give people an understanding of who Jesus was. Each of them had a point of view. 3 of them are so similar, they're called synoptic. Same view, synoptic, like optical. The same view of what Jesus had done. So our beginning today will be to lay in the life of Jesus and then lay over top of it each of the 4 evangelists. I recognize when we do that I am handling the Bible in a way that is different than I have taught you to handle the Bible. I'm going to do something and I'm going to ask you to be patient with me. I started with each Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I started teaching through them, thoroughly understanding them as best I could. With my limited abilities, I just did what I could with the 4 Gospels. Now I'm going to step on top of them and feed back to you, here's the life of Jesus, and then fit them into it. But that is not how you should begin the study. The way you should begin the study is Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and do it from the bottom up. You do not borrow the scripture to say what you already had in your outline, right? There's a difference between preaching the Bible and preaching what you want and using the Bible to say it. I'm not doing that, but it'll appear that I am. And the reason I'm being careful about that is because I have thoroughly taught each of the books and will do that with you. We will spend time in each of these books. But first, I need to give you a skeleton. That skeleton comes from understanding the books and teaching the books and walking the land. And from that skeleton, I want to develop, how does Matthew demonstrate that skeleton? Or Mark, or Luke, or John? It's almost impossible to teach a life based on any one of these Gospels. You need all 4 Gospels. Matthew gives you primarily the words of Jesus. By now you should be used to me saying this. The words of Jesus, because there are 5 major sermons in Matthew, and they are, in fact, the major backbone of it. You're going to read over and over in Matthew about the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus. Matthew 4:12, Matthew 4:23, Matthew 8:17. You're going to read over and over about this is how Jesus taught, this is how Jesus healed, this is how Jesus dealt with people. Matthew's interested in the engagement of Jesus between Jesus and the crowds, between Jesus and the disciples, between Jesus and some individuals. Now, John is radical about this. He wants to tell you every interview Jesus had with his mother at Cana, with Nicodemus in the night, with a woman at the well. He's all about these one-on-one dialogues. Matthew is more the shotgun blast of Jesus to the crowd, Jesus to the group of disciples. But you remember that Matthew 5, 6, and 7 give us the Sermon on the Mount. And by now you should be ready to jump right in there and understand that the Sermon on the Mount is going to be the kickoff of his discipleship ministry. He's going to talk about what are the character points of a disciple? What are the costs of discipleship? What are the commitment levels of a disciple? What are the choices of a disciple? That's going to be, in fact, the outline of that message. And we're going to come back and look at it. I've tried to sample it a little bit before now, but we're going to look at it. And then you're going to deal with Jesus in the Galilee and in his popular ministry, and he's going to get partway through and he's going to send out a large number of disciples, and before he does that, he's going to give a specific sermon on this is what it means to go in my name and pick up the message of the kingdom and bring it to a village. Here are the rules of how you communicate the message that the kingdom is near, and that's in Matthew 10. So I've got a sermon in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 that's on the character and the commitments and choices of a disciple, and then I've got one on how a disciple is to behave on the road. A couple of months will pass by, a year or so, and some of the disciples will defect. Some of the fringe followers, and I use the word disciple with the small d, meaning there were many, not just the 12, And some will just turn away and get cold and kind of back off. And then there'll be another message. And this message will be about success. Where is that found? 13. That is the sermon on success. What does it mean to really have an impact in ministry? And what does it mean not to? And no part of Jesus' definition of success will be about the number of chariots in the parking lot. No part of it. No part of Jesus' sermon on success will have anything to do whatsoever with popularity. And I would argue that the church in the 21st century needs to grab the 7 pictures of the standard of success in Matthew 13 and redefine success in the church. Because the franchisers and publishers are redefining Jesus' definition of success. You're not successful unless you're doing the latest 30 days of whatever. And we're running the movie on the History Channel, and you need to be running it in your sermons. As if the Spirit isn't the leader of the church, the franchisers are. And I will take issue with their definition of success from ground up. One of the reasons I'll do that is Tom over here and other people like him. If success is about popularity, then let the people on the Cocoa River die in their sin. Let's go do the things that are going to bring the bigger crowds and get more money and reaffirm our importance, because that's success. No, it's not. No, it's not. And the point is that I'm only being hard on them for one reason. They are being ungodly. Therefore, I will be hard. Let me go another direction and say that a couple of chapters go on, and it's late in the Galilee ministry, and Jesus takes his disciples, and they have their final exam. And after the final exam, Jesus is seen in all of his glory. And after that, all of the disciples are getting whipped up into a frenzy because Jesus has shown that he is God. The glory of God is shown on him. Moses came and Elijah came, and they're going, this is great. We're in the movement. We're going to win. Jesus said, strap on some swords. We're going to the Passover. They're going, yes. All right, the glory of God is going to fall in Jerusalem. He who multiplied the loaves and fishes will multiply the swords. We are going to kick out the pasta-eating pagans and get on with it. Yes. And then they begin to have a discussion about their own importance and who's more important than the other disciple. Because that is immediately what happens when the church redefines success and decides that it's doing a good job. The day your ministry swells, you decide you're really a cool person. You know how many people think I'm a cool person, you say to yourself. And then you begin to look at the other lowly disciples and say, aren't you glad I'm in the ministry together with you? And if you think that that's not what really goes on, you haven't been to a pastor's meeting. And then what happens is, Jesus says, I need to talk to you guys about getting along and forgiving one another. Because you're such boneheads, you're going to do things that wound each other, and you're going to need to know about the standard of forgiveness. And so Matthew 18 rolls out a standard of forgiveness. By the way, it comes on the back of an argument with the disciples. And so when you fast forward to Matthew 18 and you see him, it's at this point that Jesus is heading toward Jerusalem. In 19, 20, and 21, he will make his way all the way into the place of the Passion. But during that time, in the late part of his ministry, there's going to be some very hard sayings of Jesus. They're often called the bad mood sayings of Jesus. And by the time he gets into Jerusalem for the Passion, you're going to see in 21, he's going to come in. There's the triumphal entry. We'll celebrate it with Palm Sunday, and everybody's excited. But remember that the people in that text are not thinking that a spiritual king came to bring repentance to their heart and join them to the people of God. They're thinking a metallic king has come to multiply swords and kick out Romans. They're on an entirely different page than Jesus is. And Jesus saith unto the Father, Oi, what do I do with this group you gave me? And he comes into the city of Jerusalem, And partway through the week, in a lot of problems that he had with Jewish leadership, he says, I know you're impressed with the buildings of the temple. Look hard, because not one stone is going to be left standing on another. He said that, by the way, after a long 8 blistering woes in Matthew 23. See, the last sermon is really a double sermon. It's 23, and you might be a Pharisee if you look like any of the following of these 8 character traits. And then 24, Lord, look at these buildings. Look, because not one stone's going to be left on another. And he goes to the Mount of Olives and sits down and continues that last sermon in 24 with the apocalyptic narrative of how do things end. What is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And then question and answer time in 25. So I want you to think of that last sermon as a double whammy. The sermon toward the disciples about the Pharisees is 23, but toward the destruction of the temple and the end times is 24, and the question and answer that follows is 25. And that's the final sermon.
What is he saying in 24?
24 is really, he's answering the question. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And if I was looking for a word to hang it on, end would be the word. So think of it in terms of an apocalyptic sermon. It's a good question. Okay, so by the time you get to the end of the story then, between 26 and 27, you're going to have the crucifixion and resurrection story. And that will be Matthew's attempt to tell you the story of Jesus. Now, I told you all that by way of introduction because I want you to understand that Matthew gives you a very long explanation from the words of Jesus, what he is, who he is, why he came, what he's trying to do. We're going to synthetically look at the Mark, but we're going to actually make the argument that Mark doesn't start with the birth of Jesus. It doesn't even have a birth of Jesus. He hits the ground and he's ministering, and it's all about John the Baptizer in ministry. And the first 30 years of Jesus is evacuated out of the scene. It's basically he drops in and here he is ready to go. And it has more of a priestly emphasis of Jesus' ministry in the respect that until he's 30, nothing happened. From the standpoint of a priest, until you're 30, nothing happened, right? So life begins at 30, you will be happy to know. Unless you're a Vestal Virgin, then it doesn't begin until 40. But that's a whole other thing. My point is that Mark will give you in the first 9 chapters the rising tide of Jesus dealing in the Galilee ministry. And chapter 8, before the end of that, is the final exam. So 8 and 9 give you the final exam, the time of the transfiguration, and then Jesus sets his face toward the cross. And basically, you take a look at chapter 10, and it's the journey toward Jerusalem, the Perean ministry. And by chapter 11 through 16, it is the Passion Week. I'm going to set these in a frame for you. This is just the introduction. This is my preamble. Luke tries to outline not just the words that Matthew give and the works that Mark gives. Luke tries to put them in order, and that's where we're going to begin with our class and try to actually set things as best we can in order and then fit the story together. If you have the words in Matthew and the works in Mark, when you get to Luke, you get the chronology, because he says in Luke 1, 1-4, Theo, lots of people wrote the words and works, I'm going to put them in order. And John comes along and at the end of this. By the time John is writing, everybody who wrote Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and pretty much everybody they interviewed was dead. John's writing as the cherry on top of the whipped cream on top of the sundae. It's a lot later than the making of the sundae. And he says there's still something you don't understand about the Gospels. I'm going to include only some little vignettes of Jesus dealing with individuals because I need to show you the conflict that's going on in the background of the Gospels between Jesus and the Judean aristocracy. I want you to understand something. There's a conflict that's raging in the background. And so John skips most of the ministry of Jesus and summarizes all the Galilee that took Mark 1 through 9. He puts it in a chapter and a half. He said, it's incidental where something happened to me. Here's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in every time Jesus went to Jerusalem, he got in an argument. So he'll have John 3 and Nicodemus coming to him by night, but he sets it up so that he can help Nicodemus as a Pharisee understand the incredible contrast between what he's saying a walk with God is and how one gets into a walk with God and what the Pharisees are saying. The Pharisees had blurred the lines into a lifestyle. And Jesus said it starts with an event. Now you have no idea why that's important. You have no idea why that's important. But let me just tell you, yours is the generation that is taking the gospel and blurring the lines. I sat with pastors and I asked this question. Young men, seminary trained, how do I become a Christian? And I got the blurriest, longest answers you've ever heard. I got, well, it's a thing of the Spirit and it's done from within. How do I become a Christian? What must I do to be saved? And I sat with men and they couldn't answer the question. And they're the good guys. You are living in a time when you're going to watch us take a very simple gospel message and turn it into something extraordinarily hard to understand. The Pharisees had already done it, and Jesus said, born again. There's an event that happens in your life. Oh, but in the mystery of God, there's an event that happens in your life. Yeah, but it's a really spiritual thing. Yes, and I want to put you in a tank of water because I want you to see an event that happens in your life. There's something going on in the background. You're going to walk out into churches and sit and listen to invitations, and you as a believer aren't going to know when you're invited. You're going to sit there and go, what just happened? As postmodernism sweeps into the church and changes our message and blurs all the lines. Jesus deals with Nicodemus and gets him to understand the event of being born again. But that's not all he does. A couple chapters later, he's back in Jerusalem in John 5, and there's a guy lying on a porch for 38 years trying to figure out if he's committed enough to roll over into the water when an angel stirs the water at the pools of Bethesda. And every time he looks over the edge of the 42-foot drop to the bottom and says, not today. And Jesus says, get up, clean up your stuff, walk on. The guy does it, and the same day it was Sabbath, and the rest of the chapter is about an argument over Sabbath. Guy comes along in John 9 and he's sitting there and he's blind and nobody had ever paid any attention to him, and Jesus heals his blindness, and the same day it's the Sabbath and he ends up getting thrown out of the synagogue because he got healed on the wrong day of the week, like he cared what day his eyesight came back. And there ends up being a big conflict. And John's gospel is all about these conflicts that keep coming up. Every time Jesus says something, does something, there ends up a conflict. And John is trying to make the point that it's true, Jesus said some cool stuff. It's true, he did some wonderful things. It's true, he had some marvelous crowds. But the people who were in charge of the temple and the seminary hated what he was doing. And I want to tell you why. And I want to explain how he revealed who he was. And I want you to see that when you really look at who Jesus is, he revealed himself in a very profound way. And I want you to understand that the things that I'm going to share with you about his life are written that you might believe, and in believing have life. Okay, so let's begin before we go to prayer with one simple statement. The point of the record of Jesus is not to tell you all the details of his life. That's not the point. The point of the record of Jesus is to tell you enough about him that you would understand what you must believe to be saved. The point is the redemption story had come to a head. And God was about to invade man's space and dramatically take over. And the way he was going to do it was force a dividing line in the heart and mind of people. There was a day yesterday when I didn't know God. Today I can know God. I can have a permanent fixture of a relationship with God in my life, and all of the sin issue is off the table, and I can walk with him. And that's going to happen in the life of Jesus. There's a sense in which you've been building toward this since day one. You climbed your way through the hoarded household of Leviticus. You squirmed your way through the heat of the wilderness. You were pummeled by prophets and kings as you sat there and said, "No more, Jeremiah, no more." And now you get the reason for all of it. Because from the garden, God had made a promise. I'm going to raise up the seed of a woman without a man. And that one that grows up is going to crush the head of the one who brought rebellion into my world. And I'm going to make sure, along the way there'll be a wound, but I'm going to make sure his head is crushed. We're only part way to the story. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John give you the action of the stepping down on the head of the enemy. But it's not crushed until Revelation.